welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those joining the program for the first time, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is a special guest, Mr. James Lawler. He is an expert in counterintelligence and counterproliferation, formerly an officer with the CIA, and not only a consultant on issues related to counterintelligence, but also an author of novels about espionage and intelligence and all these fascinating issues that seem mysterious and challenging, and are probably even more so in reality than what they appear. We will be discussing some thorny issues concerning vulnerabilities and counterintelligence in contemporary context, things that don't always seem quite as dramatic as what we imagine national security violations to be. Sometimes intelligence-related violations and national security violations are not a secret mole from a foreign government infiltrating an agency. Sometimes it's a government official or a low-level sysadmin mishandling classified information. We'll be talking about what that means, why that has become so prevalent, and where we go from here. But first, before we get into all that, Jim, if you could tell us a little bit in more detail about yourself, your experiences in whatever terms that you can talk, and just to get our audience an idea of what you've had to grapple with.
Thank you, Irina. I'd gladly do that. I'm pleased to be on your program. I joined the CIA back in 1980. That was a few years after law school, where I first encountered the CIA. They had come to the University of Texas School of Law looking for attorneys for the CIA's Office of General Counsel. Like any government bureaucracy, we need attorneys to either keep us out of trouble or sometimes in the CIA to get us out of trouble. And so I went to this interview, and this gentleman named Mr. Bill Wood, he spoke to me for a couple of minutes, and then he asked me, he said, Jim, have you ever thought about the clandestine service? And this was 1976, and the CIA did not even have a sign out on Dodley Madison Boulevard. There was a very innocuous sign that said Federal Highway Administration. And so I said, well, no, I really don't know what the clandestine service is. And he said, well, just talking to you here for a few minutes, I think you'd be good at this. Well, I was intrigued, and I took the application. But at the time, my wife's mother was very ill, and it just was not going to be possible for us to move away to Washington, D.C., and then thousands of miles overseas to join the CIA's clandestine service. So instead of doing that, I joined a family company. And for those in the listening audience who've ever been in a family company and are no longer in a family company, it's probably due to that F word, family. And I was in a company with my dad and my two brothers, and I love them dearly. And I was making more money than I'd ever make the rest of my life. But I was really unhappy because it was so psychologically unsatisfactory. It's just making money was not the point of existence, in my opinion. And so after complaining, after about 3.5 years, my sweet wife said, Jim, you either ought to do something about it or stop your complaining. And I thought, well, you're right. Sadly, by that time, my wife's mother had passed away, so we no longer had these links to Houston, Texas that couldn't be broken. So I wrote Mr. Wood a letter, and it wasn't but 3 days later that I received a phone call, and a young lady said, you wrote Mr. Wood a letter, and he's going to be at the Holiday Inn next Thursday on the Gulf Freeway. Can you be there at 3 o'clock in the lobby? She never used the letters CIA, and I thought that was very, very good professionally. So I went to that meeting. He and I chatted, and he said, I'd like to fly you to Washington for some tests in a couple of weeks. So I did that. I came back, and about 3 months later, they asked me to come back and go through the polygraph test, go through a number of psychological batteries and other types of tests. And then a few weeks after that, they invited me to come to Washington and join the clandestine service, the Directorate of Operations. the ones who run the espionage operations abroad. And I didn't have a clue, not a clue, as to what they wanted me to do. But I was so unhappy in Texas, I thought I'd take a job on the planet Neptune if they offered it to me. So I moved to Texas with my wife. She was pregnant with our first child, and not knowing exactly what the CIA wanted me to do. But I found out pretty quickly. And to be blunt, they wanted me to manipulate people, to exploit people, to subvert people, to suborn people, to convince them to become a spy, to betray a trust, to commit treason. Those are all harsh words, but we do that in order to gain access to classified information in foreign governments that we need for our own national security. And I found out that not only was I pretty good at it, but I enjoyed the hell out of it. And I loved that. I did it for 25 years. The last half of my career, a little more than the last half, I worked especially against programs that were trying to obtain weapons of mass destruction. You can think of programs like maybe the Iranian nuclear program or the Syrian nuclear program, programs that could wreak so much devastation upon either the United States or our allies. And so I worked either sometimes unilaterally on behalf of the United States, sometimes in close coordination with our allies. And I found this to be not only interesting work, but it was what I call psychologically righteous, to stop a foreign government, a rogue government, an adversary of the West, obtaining either a nuclear or a biological weapon and saving, theoretically, or more than theoretically, actually saving thousands and thousands of lives. So that's, I'm sorry, a long-winded introduction to me. I loved my job. I continue to teach in the intelligence community, and I write my spy novels as a way, a creative outlet. I can't run operations anymore, but I can create some stories.
That sounds like a very fascinating entry into a world that to many people seems shrouded in enigma and incomprehensible, and popular culture certainly supports that perception, and I'll get to that towards the end of the interview. In the meantime, however, I listened very carefully to a couple of your recent podcasts, one of which included a question about the qualities that make somebody a good case officer, a good recruiter of spies, and you described these qualities at in some depth. And I'm curious, when you interviewed with Mr. Wood, how, in your opinion, was he able to assess the presence of those qualities so quickly, given that you've initially talked to him for only a few minutes, and many of those qualities are generally enhanced through experience, through practice, through dedication to becoming a better listener and more compassionate, more engaged with your targets and so forth?
Irina, that's a great question. In fact, a few people have asked me that. Here, this gentleman, Mr. Wood, was looking for attorneys, but within a minute or two, he starts to ask me if I'd become an operations officer, a case officer, and why did he switch tracks so quickly? I think it's because he was a retired case officer himself, and the old saying about it takes one to know one, you know, the qualities. And I think he saw in me, fortunately, he saw in me the fact that I am a curious person. I've got a fairly strong set of interpersonal skills. I'm a good listener. I like to tell my students that I teach in the FBI and the CIA and DIA that you don't recruit people when you're talking. You don't recruit people in transmit mode. You recruit people when you're listening. And I'm a good listener. I'm patient. I have a fairly quiet, soft voice. One of my assets that I recruited, she told me, she said, Jim, when I'm listening to you, it's like my brain is in a warm waterbed. And that's exactly the kind of thing I want people to feel like, that they can relax. I half jokingly say, if I had not become a case officer, I think I would have loved being either a psychiatrist or a psychologist, because I'm a very curious person. I love to know what makes people tick. And I don't do it just for professional reasons. I do it because I'm just intensely curious. What makes you tick? Why do you think that? And then I have a knack for being able to detect what I call stresses or stress fractures. I used to be a rock climber, and sometimes I ask people in audiences that I teach, I said, how many of you are rock climbers? And usually one or two people in the class will raise their hands. And I say, so tell me, what is it you look at when you climb a rock? And they'll tell me, well, you're looking for the stress fractures, the cracks, the crack patterns, so that you can put your fingers and your toes, you can climb up the cracks in the rock because you can't climb bald, smooth rock. You have to look for the crack patterns. And you can't see those from a long way off. You have to get close and study it. And it's the same with people. Everybody has stress fractures. They have crack patterns. They have stress in their life. I jokingly say, if you don't have stress in your life, you're probably dead. Really, everybody's got these stress patterns. Sometimes it takes a while to detect the stress patterns. In one case, it took me 11 years when I first met a gentleman overseas, and he was on top of the world. He didn't need anything I had to offer, except I could offer him friendship. But you can't base a recruitment simply on friendship, or rarely can you do that. But over time, things happened in his life. And by the time 10 and a half years later, he had gone through a very ugly divorce. In fact, I'd been best man at his wedding. That's, when I'm going after somebody, you and I are going to be very close, and you and I are going to be best friends. And I literally was best man at his wedding. But sadly, within 2 or 3 years of that marriage, he had moved away to another foreign country. And his new wife got tired of living thousands of miles from her homeland. And so she took their one child, their baby, and went home. So suddenly his life was in a psychologically chaotic sea, a rough sea. I mean, it's the ugliest thing probably that you can go through is a divorce, psychologically, financially, everything else. And then it got even worse for him professionally because he was reassigned to the capital of his home country. And in the years that he had been gone, a new regime had come into power and a new ethnic group, and he wasn't part of that ethnic group. And he found out and wrote me a note. He said, Jim, I could work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and I'll never be promoted again because I'm not part of the ruling ethnic group. And he said, I think that any country which treats its citizens like that, how can those citizens give allegiance to it? So he's showing me big, big problems. And so I told him, I said, why don't you and I meet in this third country? I know you're going back to visit your daughter and your ex-wife on your daughter's birthday. Let me talk about how you and I can maybe have some business opportunities together, be on my team. And so I met him in a third country. We chatted. And within 30 seconds, I broke cover. By that, I mean, no longer am I just a State Department officer. I said, I want to thank you for protecting my identity. You may have suspected that I was a CIA officer, but I want to confirm it to you now. And I want to offer you the opportunity to come join me and be part of my team. And he looked at me and he said, Jim, now I've got something to believe in. And boy, he worked for us. He was wonderful. And he went back into his country. And he was there when 9/11 happened here in New York City. And he said, I got very emotional. I was there in my office and I saw those twin towers burning and these poor, lives of all these people snuffed out. And he said, I got emotional. And he says, I was almost crying. And he said, my colleagues there at the foreign ministry, they were wondering, why are you so wrapped up in this? And he says, it was almost a counterintelligence threat that I was becoming so emotional about it. And what I couldn't tell them was now I'm part of your team. I'm part of America's team. So this was a dagger in my heart as well. And so that's kind of the things that I'm looking for. I'm getting people. I never used force. I never used blackmail. Other services use those. The Russians are skilled at that. The Chinese are skilled at it. But I don't believe in using blackmail or extortion or any kind of coercion like that, because that would be like I'm driving down a street and I have a rattlesnake in the back seat. Why would I want that? I don't want that. I want you to be positively motivated to work with me, to spy for me, to help me out, to help the United States of America out. And I want to keep you motivated. One of my colleagues once said, Jim, you're nothing but a cheerleader. So that's okay. If I can make you feel good, if I can offer you the respect and the self-esteem that your colleagues deny, then I'm doing my job. You're feeling good about it, and I'm feeling good about it. And then sometimes people do this, they commit espionage really out of revenge, out of anger. And I found that out too, that anger and revenge is one of the purest motivations for espionage. And sometimes you can't tell it on the front end. I had early in one of my early tours, I received a note, a classified note from CIA headquarters, and they were looking for citizens of a certain foreign country that we were going to enter into some negotiations with about a year and a half later. And sadly, the CIA had no sources in this other country's negotiating team that could tell them exactly what the positions were. And so we were going into this very high stake negotiation with no insights into what the other side wanted, what their bottom line was, nothing at all. And this treaty that we were going to have, this series of negotiations, meant a lot of money to national security. So they described the type of person that we CIA officers abroad should be targeting, going after. And as luck would have it, I had met a gentleman just exactly fitting the criteria that they required a few weeks earlier. I had met him quite innocently in a ski class, and he and I had been friendly to one another, but I had no interest in him until I received this classified cable from CIA headquarters. So I called him up, and over the next few weeks, I intensified what we call the developmental stage. That's where we're building the friendship, building the trust. And after 2, 3 months, perhaps at the longest, I finally decided, I think I could convince this gentleman to commit espionage. Now, classically, what you're supposed to do is look for those vulnerabilities, the stresses, to how can I offer you something that can relieve your problem? In this case, I thought very naively that I could convince this gentleman to become a spy simply based on the strength of my friendship with him, the fact that he and I had such strong friendship already after only a few months. I mean, we really did click. The chemistry was there. But this was very naive. However, Washington back home was so desperate for sources in this other government's service, they approved my recruitment proposal. So I took him to a restaurant, and I rather bluntly, probably because this was my very, very first recruitment pitch, trying to convince someone to become a spy for the United States, I pitched him bluntly, offered him a nice sum of money as a retainer, a consulting fee, to give us some privileged insights into his country's negotiating positions. He looked at me and he said, Jim, he said, you and I are friends, but what you're proposing would be morally wrong. And so I said, well, I don't think it's morally wrong for two friends to help each other. And he says, Jim, this would be morally wrong. Now, I've pitched, I'd say, in excess of 60 people in my career to commit espionage, and he is the only person ever to pose a moral objection. Most of the time, if you get turned down, it's for one reason and one reason only, and that's fear. I had an African intelligence officer tell me once, Jim, they hang people in my country for doing things like that. And he's right, they would hang him. But then he surprised me and he said, but could I have a rain check? I said, a rain check? He said, yeah. He said, my son, he's only 3 years old now, and I don't need you now. But in 15 years, he will be a university age person, and I might need you to help get him into a good university. So I wrote that down. 15 years later, this gentleman was posted to the United States, and the division, Africa division, came and said, do you think he meant what he said? I said, oh, knowing him, I think he did. And we cashed that rain check in 15 years later. But go back to my first recruitment there. I'm sorry for the digression, but my friend turns me down. And we have an expression at the CIA that it's okay to be turned down, but not turned in. Meaning, what if he goes and complains to his ambassador that I've just propositioned him to commit espionage? And that ambassador had a fiery temper, and I could just, in my mind's eye, envision this hot-headed ambassador storming into the American ambassador, my ambassador's office, and lodging a strongly worded protest about the outrageous behavior of young James Lawler coming over, trying to convince in fact, it was his deputy. It was the number 2 guy in this embassy. And here, how outrageous that I just propositioned the ambassador's deputy, the deputy chief of mission, to become a spy, to become a traitor. Well, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be terrible. This is going to happen. This will end my career. They'll send me home, probably Langley back home at headquarters. People will be doing what we call CYA, cover your what, because they will think Lawler messed this up. Even though he had permission to do it, he messed it up. Well, I was anguishing over that for 2 or 3 days. And finally, I worked up the courage to call him just to take his temperature and smooth any rough seas that might have happened. Make sure we're still friends. So I called him. And the fact that he didn't hang up in my ear was initially, that was very good. I was thinking, thank God, he'll at least talk to me. And then I said to him, well, you just had so much fun the other night. I thought maybe we'd go out again this next Friday. This was 1 week later, 1 week. And he told me, much to my delight, he said, Jim, I was thinking the same thing. Another dinner would be really very enjoyable. So I go to the second dinner 1 week after the first dinner with the only purpose to make sure that he and I still are friends and that he hasn't told anybody about our secret, the fact that I tried to get him to become a traitor. First words out of his mouth at that second dinner, Jim, is that offer you made me last Friday still good? And I said, well, of course, I made that because we're friends. And he says, well, what you don't know is that I've just heard from my wife that she wants a divorce. And I can't go back to my country next year, pay her the alimony to which she's entitled, and put my 2 teenage sons in private schools so that they get a quality education. I can't do that unless I take your offer. He says, I know it's morally wrong, but I don't have a choice. Well, we have a saying in law school that when the judge rules in your favor, shut up and get out of court. And so I didn't argue with him. And the first time he brought me a stack of classified material, and it must have been 3 inches thick, I found out that it wasn't just the divorce, the psychological devastation, the financial needs, the fact that he loved his children, he wanted his sons to have the best education. Those were all reasons. But the real motivation behind this gentleman was when he handed me the material and he said, Jim, let me tell you how much I hate my ambassador. He said, that cocky little son of a bitch goes around and he takes credit for everything I do in the embassy and everything that everybody else does. And he goes around this country here as if he's the only person doing any work. He says, I can't stand him. And as I hand you this classified material, it's as if I'm kicking that son of a bitch in the face. I took the material from him and I said, we're a great team. Bring me some more of this so we can kick him again. And he laughed, and he did. He was wonderful. But it got even better than that. So then we had to put him through a polygraph test. And I'm not a big fan of polygraph tests. It's a stress detector. But we were going to give him basically a very limited counterintelligence polygraph test, consisting of essentially 3 questions. Number 1, have you told anybody about your secret relationship with CIA? And that's pretty black or white. Secondly, are you working with any intelligence service other than CIA? Again, pretty simple. And thirdly, did someone direct you to volunteer to Mr. Lawler at that second dinner? So that should be pretty easy too. And the polygrapher, the operator, is not supposed to stray from those questions. He's supposed to stick to that script and not go off on a fishing expedition. But I had a young, inexperienced operator, and the first question out of his mouth to my friend was, I'm just curious why you're doing this. And so I had almost a heart attack. I was thinking, oh my God, he's going to have the moral epiphany and he's going to storm out of this room. But to my delight, my friend, he laughed and he said, I'm doing this because I think it's going to be a lot of fun. He was a thrill seeker. And that's another motivation for some people to become spies. Well, it ended up on a happy note. He went back to his country. He gave us the insights that we needed. And it was estimated that not only could he tell us what their positions were, but their fallback positions. And it was estimated that that successful set of negotiations saved the United States and the national security establishment billions of dollars. So if you ask me what's this worth, it can be worth a heck of a lot. But I learned that revenge, and that's what he was after. And in fact, you ask yourself, why would you betray a trust? And he told me, he said, it's because they've betrayed me first. That's what he felt. And that might be retroactive justification, but that's why people do this a lot of times. Normally, if you're raised in a right type of environment and you have a good set of morals about you, you would never do this unless you felt you had been betrayed first. And that's how he looked at it, and how a lot of the people that I recruited looked at it. They're now part of my team, so they want to join a different team. They feel like they're disaffected. We used to look at, a foreign embassy, maybe a hostile embassy establishment, Russia, China, whatever. And we'd watch at quitting time as several employees would come out and they're slapping each other in the back and they're headed off to a bar for a little after work drink. We're not interested in those people. We're interested in the one guy that comes out a few minutes later and he's all by himself and he's not feeling like part of the team. In fact, he may be pissed off about something. And so we can offer him the opportunity to come and join our team. So being patient, being persistent, being curious, being empathetic. I think I have a fairly strong sense of empathy. If I want to recruit you, Irina, I've got to get inside your head and find out what are Irina's problems. Everybody's got problems. And if I can offer you a solution to your problems, then you might think, actually, that's something I want to do. So doing that, watching stressors in people's lives, that was basically the secret to my success. And I tell my students, I say, not once did I recruit a happy person. You don't recruit happy people. You recruit the disaffected.
Now, to follow the top, you mentioned a number of different things that make someone a potential target for recruitment. These stress factors, dissatisfaction with the conditions in their country, needing money for whatever reason, sometimes a combination of all of the above, personal motives. But are there any personality types that contribute to someone becoming a spy for a foreign agency? As opposed to, because many people do have all these factors and don't become spies, and they take other solutions to resolve their problems. They leave their jobs, they move somewhere, they undertake some other ways of resolving their problems. So what makes someone susceptible to becoming a spy? Is it
Again, something, in one case, a certain degree of narcissism, where people are narcissistic, sociopathic in a sense. They feel like the world owes them the thing, that they're the solution to everything. I think narcissism was behind Edward Snowden's motivations a number of years ago when he divulged a lot of the NSA secrets. I think narcissism and immaturity was the motivation behind that young airman in Massachusetts who was putting all of those classified documents online. It was a combination of narcissism and immaturity. I mean, he wasn't doing it deliberately to help or to hurt the United States government. In fact, he was just doing it hey, guys, look at me. Here he is, a 21-year-old, immature, narcissistic, and it made him feel powerful, made him feel good to do that. He was not a whistleblower at all. Snowden claims to have been a whistleblower, but Snowden, the amount of material that Snowden revealed, over 90% of the things that he revealed had nothing to do with the United States or U.S. citizens. It had to do with some of our capabilities around the world against very dangerous adversaries. But he likes to, hold out that he was a justified whistleblower. But we have ways to go. We have routes that are approved to go for whistleblowers, and he didn't do that at all. He decided to just take things into his own hands, and he was going to be one of the most effective spies ever. Kind of almost like a John Wilkes Booth, going to bring down the president, going to assassinate the president. I think, in fact, I think sometimes the motivations between a presidential assassin and somebody who does something like this are at least somewhat similar. The degree of narcissism. And now if you recruit an asset like that, you've got to be very careful because this person can get out of control. So sometimes it's a double-edged sword who we recruit and what we're looking for. But I'd say that most of the people whom I recruited, they were normal people, not pure narcissists. Everybody's got a certain degree of narcissism in them, but these were just disaffected people, people who I was able to reach, people who I was able to bond with and make them feel important. Sometimes it was a lack of respect or a perceived, they weren't being treated fairly. And if I could treat them fairly and be sincere about it, and I was sincere, I absolutely fulfilled every one of my promises to these people, then they could perceive that and they knew that they could trust me. Because finally, if you look at the foundation of any human relationship, regardless if it's a romance relationship or an espionage relationship, the basis is trust. And they were able to trust me, and I had to trust them.
Now, you make a very important point, and that leads me to my next question. This issue of the foundation of trust. To what extent political factors outside your personal control, the decisions of the agency or even the decisions of the US government, political decisions that are not that even above the agency affect this issue of recruitment? To what extent do people can people be put off by political factors, by concerns about their own safety, by the agencies or the US government's commitment to keep its promises, if there is some political shift between countries, for instance?
Well, sometimes we can recruit people based on a political or ideological basis. I mean, I have had some recruitments which basically they were doing this not for money, not for anything other than the fact that they hated the system, the government that they were in. It could have been communism, it could have been socialism, it could have been that they felt that their government was wrong, going towards a weapon of mass destruction program, and they genuinely felt like I've got to stop this. But if you ask me, have I recruited people who politically would object to a lot of what the United States does? Yes, I've done that. That was less relevant to some people. I mean, they might politically, have strong objections to some of the things that the U.S. government does, but they were able to, however, they were able to rationalize this. They would overlook that because they wanted to do this for other reasons. I mean, let's face it. I mean, I don't agree with all the policies of my government either, but and I'm sure you don't either. But and sometimes we get people that you'd say, well, how could that person, work with us when in fact, they can't stand some of the policies of the United States. And well, but they did. They did. I jokingly, not joking, but you've probably heard of the spy Robert Hansen, and Robert Hansen was a very, very twisted individual. Here he was, a staunch Catholic, a member of Opus Dei, which is one of the more, fundamentalist parts of the Catholic Church. And yet he was able to betray the United States. He had a twisted mind. So again, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know, but I've never had anybody tell me no because they said, well, I can't stand U.S. foreign policy. Nobody ever said that. I mean, some U.S. foreign policy I don't like, but it didn't play into it. And so, but it's a good question, because some people you think, well, and then there are some people who think the U.S. foreign policy is great, but they wouldn't spy for the United States, but they might still agree with us. I'll tell you a quick story that kind of touches on what you're talking about. But I was on one of my early tours, I was developing a gentleman from an Asian country. In fact, I was developing two people from the same embassy of an Asian country where we needed some sources. And we have not a rule, but a guideline that if you're going after one person in an embassy, you really shouldn't go after two people in the same embassy because they start to compare notes and wonder why Jim Lawler is chatting up these two guys, and they might start thinking, is this an intelligence developmental operation or what? Well, I decided that I would, after somebody said from headquarters said, well, look, Jim, go with one of the guys, but drop the other one as a contact. So I said, okay. So I started developing the man who was a little bit closer to me in age, thinking that, being more contemporaneous, more of the same age, same issues, that we could understand each other, and this could lead to a recruitment. Well, that went on for a couple of years, and the guy was marginally helpful, but I'm not going to lie to you. I didn't really recruit this man as a spy. He shared some things with me out of friendship. I mean, he did some stuff, but to call it a real spy, no, it really wasn't. And then about a week before I was to leave this country, somebody asked if they could throw a going away party for my family and me. And I said, sure. And so they asked for a guest list. And on the guest list, I put actually both the people from this Asian country on the guest list. Well, I finally, and this is like 2.5 years after I met the older gentleman from this country, I was chatting with him, and he was there, and he was being very reflective. And he said, Jim, let me tell you a story. He said, after World War II, it was in the late 40s, he said, my brother was out swimming in a lake, and there was an American GI who was posted in my country, and he was walking by the lake, and he looked out and he said, my brother was starting to get cramps and he was drowning. And this American GI jumped in the lake and he saved my brother's life. And then he said to me, he said, Jim, I'd do anything for America. And I thought, oh my God, I went after the wrong guy. And here I only have a few days left, but an emotional attachment that had nothing to do with American foreign policy or anything else. It was just this emotional debt that he felt that we were the ones that saved his brother.
That is quite amazing, and I think a lot of this is understated in there are some stereotypes that a lot of this recruitment is just about trapping someone to sexual relationships or blackmail or putting essentially that sort of pressure. And the stereotype behind that is the idea that you have more control if you have leverage over somebody. To what extent that issue of control and being able to control somebody plays into the process?
Okay, you do want control. In fact, you want to be the coach. I tell people, look, I'm the expert in security, and in order to keep you safe, you've got to do what I say. Mm-hmm. And we're on the same team, but I'm the coach of the team. And so I want you to know that I will protect you, and I will, as long as you do what I tell you to do, that this is this is going to be this kind of good teamwork that we have together. Now that also means that I hope that you'll come up with some ideas, and they do. Frequently they'll come up with ideas. They'll tell me things that I didn't even know about them. I had one person, for instance, I was running from a third world country that has a nuclear weapons program, and the man once he said, Jim, it's funny you've never asked me what my wife does. And I said, so what does your wife do? And he said, she's a nuclear weapons designer. And I went, whoa, I got to meet your wife. Just little things that you didn't even ask, but that somebody will tell you after a while, and then sometimes they help you. The best type of relationship is where they help you do your job. And I always tried to get them rewarded. I would, I might start them out at a certain retainer, a certain consulting fee, but already have advance approval that 6 months into the relationship that I would give them a bonus or something to keep them even more, say what great job that we're doing together as a team. Sometimes I was able to use that as an incentive to lead into a recruitment pitch. I might have dinner with somebody and they would share some mildly interesting, but not really classified information. But I'd come back to them the next time and I'd say, that information you shared with me, I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of writing that up and sending it into Washington to my headquarters. And this morning, when I came into the office, I found out that they had given me a $2,000 Exceptional Performance Award. And I feel guilty taking that money because that was your intellectual property. That was your idea. Won't you at least share this bonanza with me? And I'd give them $1,000 in an envelope, and they'd be thinking, gosh, Jim shared that with me, and that wasn't really classified. I wonder what he would do if it was a little sexier. And they would actually start volunteering things to me, going down the slippery slope because I was being generous with them. And I was extremely protective, extremely generous with everybody I ever recruited. I looked upon this literally as a team sport to keep them motivated, to keep them focused, to keep them wanting to please me and to please Washington. I'd tell them sometimes that, and I was being truthful. I'd say, the President of the United States read that information you gave me, and he wants me to thank you for it. And here, the leader of the free world, they're being influential on America. That was a very powerful thing to tell somebody. It was almost like an elixir and almost like an alcoholic beverage. It made them feel so high, so good.
Oh, that's quite amazing, and that's certainly a great way of keeping people motivated in a way that's very, very positive. And I think, again, that kind of public perception, I think there's not enough of that positivity. Now,
Well, yeah, and that's why I give a lot of insider threat talks, and I say, if you want to prevent somebody like me from recruiting one of your employees, treat them fairly. Let them know that they are a valued member of the team. That doesn't mean you have to give them everything they want, but at least let them know that they are being treated the same as everybody else, and that you will be a booster for them. And if you do that, that makes my job exceedingly difficult to come in and try and insert myself and to win them over to our side. My son was a young Marine in combat in Iraq. And of course, he was fighting for the United States against terrorists, but he was really fighting for those other Marines that were side by side with him. They were feeling like they are members of a team and they do anything for each other. And that's what I try and tell people, bosses, treat people fairly, don't play favorites, and listen to them. If they've got problems, see if you can help. That's why any organization, they should have some kind of an employee assistance program to know that if something goes wrong, that if they're in need of some help, that the organization will stand behind them and help them out. And then also you have to observe the stressors in people's lives. If they're drinking too much, if they're using narcotics, if they're getting into gambling debts, things like that could make them vulnerable to suddenly thinking, I could sell this information and get myself out of this predicament that I'm in. So my advice is treat people fairly and listen.
unfortunately, a lot of the times, giant bureaucracies are not particularly conducive to that sort of a personable connection, which creates its own problems. And I'm curious, when you're credited with bringing down the AQ-CON network, and that will lead me directly to the next part of our conversation, which is the U.S. domestic concerns. AQ-CON and his network, the whole idea of the nuclear proliferation program, it certainly was a huge issue of prestige for its developers. So what made the individuals in question susceptible to recruitment? How were you able to achieve something that seemed to be exactly the sort of thing you're talking about, that would unify people around the common goal, get them a sense of a larger, something bigger than themselves, a contribution to their country, and so forth?
Well, Dr. A.Q. Khan was an extremely charismatic individual. And I mean, when we talk about the AQ Con network, I mean, he had personally recruited all the members of this network. Um, I'd never thought about this before, but Dr. Khan would have probably been a heck of a powerful case officer.
Mhm.
He would motivate his people. He kept them. He paid them well. He got them, did things, and in return, they stole all kinds of nuclear information from the Urenco Corporation in Europe. This started in the Netherlands when Dr. Kahn himself was an employee of Urenco. That's the Uranium Enrichment Corporation, which has designed ultracentrifuges for enriching uranium for use in peaceful nuclear power plants. But if you use the same technology, which is highly restricted, if you use that same technology enough, you can go from a low enriched uranium for a nuclear power plant up to highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. And so he saw Pakistan being behind India. India had detonated a nuclear weapon in the early 70s, and the Pakistanis had vowed to obtain nuclear weapons themselves. And so he had possession of these very sensitive documents, designs for centrifuge enrichment of uranium. And so he stole that and set up this network of Europeans, not Pakistanis, but Europeans in Europe to help steal that information for Pakistan. He went to Pakistan, established what was initially called Engineering Research Laboratory, ERL, and then after a few years, he was so successful they renamed it Kahn Research Laboratory, KRL. And but then Dr. Kahn was not only a very charismatic individual, he was also extremely narcissistic. And so he decided to take proliferation private. And I think a lot of the Western intelligence organizations, we were always prepared for country to country proliferation, you know, seeing somebody, one country provide another country, perhaps weapons designs or things like that. But what we were not prepared for was a powerful, charismatic individual such as Dr. Kahn to take proliferation private and strike a deal with the Libyans, you know, with Libya, to provide them with a nuclear weapons program. This was not the Pakistani government dealing directly with Libya at all. In fact, the Pakistani government knew nothing about it. It was strictly Dr. Kahn and his confederates, his network, that was providing this information and supervising the installation of uranium enrichment centrifuges in Libya. And so that was the first instance we'd ever seen of this very, very powerful individual doing this on a private basis. Now, he was making a lot of money on this, a lot of money. He would probably tell you if he were here on this program, well, I did it for religious reasons. This was a fellow Islamic country. And of course, they played on that. You know, all of the other Islamic countries were saying, you know, you're the savior of the Islamic world, and that played to his ego. He had a powerful his ego, and you know, wouldn't fit into a room. In fact, I jokingly say, you know, Dr. Kahn, he's kind of like he's so popular in Pakistan that had he run for president, he would have been elected. And he's kind of like if you rolled up George Washington, Elvis Presley, and Robert Oppenheimer in one. That was Dr. Kahn, basically, a genius at networking. He had his own public relations people. But the Pakistani senior levels of the Pakistani government knew nothing about what he was doing. Certainly, President Musharraf of Pakistan at the time knew nothing. He actually hated Kahn. And when Director George Tenet, CIA Director George Tenet, confronted Musharraf about this and said Dr. Kahn had betrayed the Pakistani atomic weapons program, actually Musharraf wanted to kill Kahn. And our director, George Tenet, said, no, we just want you to stop him. And so they put him under house arrest, which he's remained for the next 5 years. And anyways, we brought down the rest of the network. So my team was the one that did this. It was almost an 8 or 9 year program that we did it. And we ultimately were able to secure certain human penetrations of the network in order to bring it down. And I can't go into more detail than that, but that's what ultimately worked.
Interestingly enough, since then, some of the more government-related elements have become a more of a security concern. To mention two recent operations, one included a collaboration between an RGC and an ISI individuals who penetrated the Secret Service in the United States successfully and through bribery, from what I understand. And another incident involving uranium smuggling through an Omanian commercial airline to Heathrow towards RGC operatives who were stationed there, that was intercepted, and the Pakistan foreign minister denied that this took place, but the uranium originated where it did. And so either negligence was, was extreme, or the Pakistani government or elements of it were in some ways complicit. But these two incidents, it's interesting enough, very quickly went away from the headlines in the media. And especially the incident involving Secret Service penetration, when these two individuals were able to leave the United States, to me are quite puzzling, because that level of security breach is quite serious. What can you say about these circumstances, and how it was being handled?
Well, I'm not entirely familiar with these incidents, and I'm certainly not privy to the classified aspects of it. But we have to pay attention that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, these organizations have been trained and are highly intelligent people. And in fact, we do ourselves a disservice if we think, well, this is a third world nation that can't do this. These people, let me tell you something. The Iranians were inventing whole fields of mathematics when a lot of our relatives were still painting their faces blue and living in caves. So we are wrong if we think the Iranians can't figure this out. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, they're extremely bright. They know how to, they're extremely good at counterintelligence. They're very diligent. They're very persistent. And they use the same techniques we use. They've got people that are brilliant. So you do yourself a disservice if you underestimate your adversary. I don't really know the details of these things. It doesn't surprise me at all. I know that, for instance, you probably are familiar with this, but the Iranians have always, of course, they in their nuclear weapons program, they would want to have insights into what the International Atomic Energy Agency is doing. Well, they had a penetration of the IAEA that was giving them heads up on when inspections were coming and things like that. That's logical. That's, if I wanted to have a covert nuclear weapons program, then I'd want a spotter inside of the IAEA, and that's what they did. They had one. So you've got to look at your adversary and figure out, okay, if I was him or her, what would I do? And this is the kind of thing, that you start thinking, well, they probably have a mole somewhere, like in the IAEA or in some U.S. organization. We get very arrogant if we think that the Iranians or someone like that can't recruit somebody. I mean, we have a poor track record. Look at some of the, the spies that have been arrested, both that have been run by either the Russians or the Chinese. And so it's a very, I remember the first time I was peripherally involved in the Aldrich Ames exposure. I happened to have a source that gave us some critical information that helped narrow down the fact that it was definitely Aldrich Ames. But I remember coming out of the briefing feeling sick in my stomach that somebody could betray us. Now, I know that's ironic because that's exactly what I was doing to them. And it's almost funny. I mean, it's pathetic in the sense I was so naive that I would imagine, now, how could somebody, CIA officer, betray us to the Russians when exactly, I was hoping to do that to them. But that's the way I felt. And I literally was sick at my stomach, and we were right, I mean, so I don't know. You fall into a mind trap. Thinking that we're so noble and we're so much better than they are, and that they could never penetrate us. I have a good friend, one of the absolute deans of counterintelligence, Paul Redmond, and he said it's an actuarial certainty that the U.S. is penetrated because we have so many people with top secret clearances. I mean, thousands, hundreds of thousands. It is an actuarial certainty that we're penetrated, and probably quite substantially. So it's a major challenge.
Do you think the issue is oversharing of these clearances, having just too many people involved in the intelligence apparatus? Would we be better off with smaller, more flexible intelligence agencies?
Irina, I think I'm going to put you in charge. I think that's definitely a solution. I think we've gotten way too generous with the clearances. We're top heavy. We have a lot of people that I agree with you. I think a smaller, leaner service. Look at the British. Look at the Israeli services. They're small. They're lean. They're nimble. In fact, my great grandfather was a general in the Union Army under General Grant, and Grant he had a triple strategy at Vicksburg, and he said first, move swiftly, do the unexpected, seize every opportunity. That was his mantra: move quickly, do the unexpected, seize every opportunity. And I ask myself sometimes, is the CIA following that? I don't think so. I mean, I love the CIA, but we've gotten so large. We've gotten, layers and layers. And so we're seldom can we move quickly, do the unexpected, or seize every opportunity. I had to pass up opportunities all the time because we didn't have the resources to go after it, because we were spread thin on some things, and yet we were spread too thick on other things that really had no relevance. A lot of the fact that we've had such CI failures in the last few years is the fact we were distracted since 9/11, so since 2001, by counterterrorist operations, to where it was consuming, I bet you it was consuming 60 to 75% of our intelligence resources. At the same time, the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians increased their activities against us. So it was almost as if, we were at the front of the store trying to keep the terrorists out of the front of the store, when in fact the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians were backing up trucks to the back of the store and just loading up like intelligence, information. So we were distracted, much to their enjoyment, by counter-terrorist operations, and we had to. We just had lost 3,300 people in 9/11, but I think it's been way too long that we haven't swung back to looking at the state espionage operations against us. I think had we started swinging back this way 10 years ago, it would have been appropriate. And only now are we starting to look at this, and people would ask, well, do we have greater espionage efforts going against us right now? Well, you're asking a question that's probably unanswerable, because you never know quantifiably what's the total amount of espionage operations going on. We certainly are uncovering more of them, and that's because we're focusing more resources on it. But I'd say that if anything, I think the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians have increased the pace of their espionage operations against us. The FBI has said that they open a new Chinese counterintelligence case almost every 12 hours. Think of that, 2 a day. That's over 750 cases in a year. I'm not surprised. I mean, the FBI is overwhelmed. The Chinese are like running espionage human wave attacks at us, and they know that some will be caught, but a lot of them will get through.
Well, our enemies are doing exactly what we can expect them to do. We, on the other hand, are doing things that are, well, this brings me to my question about some of these self-inflicted injuries. I'm not just talking about the expected numbers of, moles and people angling for more money, or disaffected individuals who get recruited. I'm talking about public officials who end up mishandling classified information at top level, and we've seen bipartisan failures in that respect. And it's been going on for a number of years. Many people only are aware of the most recent several, but this has been going back, a while, and without very little reaction. To what extent are such situations actually damaging, and to what extent do they send a bad signal, bad strategic communication messaging, first of all, to domestic security apparatus in general about the level of care for these documents, and to the foreign agencies seeking exploiting vulnerabilities.
Well, you've hit a real tender chord there, Irina. The recent revelations of documents, secret documents, and things being mishandled by some senior members of certain administrations, and that, by the way, is for all the administrations. Sometimes these politicians become very arrogant, let it go to their heads, and that they can handle this stuff however they want to, and the people around them are intimidated or afraid to say, no, you really need to be careful about this. You can't use your cell phone to just call people up because everybody's got your cell phone. They know how to intercept that. Or you're using these documents and you're being very careless. I've seen this, though, this carelessness. It's not just Republicans. It's not just Democrats. It's a lot of these people become very arrogant. And to be a successful politician, you do have to have a certain degree of narcissism and charisma, and it goes to their heads sometimes that they don't think about the ramifications of what they're doing, and that this could harm U.S. intelligence efforts. I had recruited a very senior part of a chain, a delegation one time, and his information was extremely delicate. And he also revealed some personal information to my spy, to my contact, very personal information. And the next time this senior member of this delegation met one of our counterparts, a very senior politician, the politician let him know that he knew about it. And it just gave me almost a heart attack, because here my spy there, he was one of about 3 people that knew this. So the list of usual suspects was very small, and we had to tell this senior politician that, hey, I wish please don't say that type of thing. None of these politicians are trained in intelligence matters, but we have to make them aware of the ramifications and the downsides, that we would never, ever want one of our sources compromised like that. And, the type of things where documents are mishandled and suddenly our sources are going to dry up on what's going on, or other governments won't trust us with their sensitive information, which is, we depend a lot on our allies providing us very sensitive information. And if our senior politicians mishandle it, then that source of information is going to dry up. They're going to say, don't share this with the Americans, because the next thing you know, our sources will be compromised. And so we just have to keep reminding politicians, and especially the people around them. We refer to them as the spear holders, the people around them. We need to keep reinforcing the fact that this is sensitive. By sensitive, I mean it's sensitive information. This is what gives us the edge in our negotiations. It gives us the edge in our intelligence operations around the world. The fact that we had sources in Russia that could maybe give us a tip-off that they were going to invade Ukraine, that's wonderful. But we can't be careless and blasé about it.
Now, there's been a lot of public backlash against criticism of these actions by politicians. The backlash to the nature of, well, we are overclassifying too many things that should be public information anyway, and it's everybody is doing it, and therefore it's selective if we choose, if we prosecute those guys and not these guys, and nobody should be going to jail for this. To what extent is that helpful, and how can we kind of enforce, get away from politics and enforce a common sense security-oriented approach that is uniform to everyone involved, and that prevents this sort of kind of partisan and demagogic public defense of such people?
Well, that's a good point. The fact is I'm sure that we do overclassify things. It's a natural thing. If you're a CIA employee, and you never get your hand slapped for classifying it top secret, But if you classified it only confidential and it really was top secret, you know, you could be fired. So it's a natural human reaction to kind of overclassify things. But we need to take a more common sense approach to a lot of this. The fact that we have still had documents about the JFK assassination, which took place in 1963. So we're talking, you know, almost 60 years ago. It is 60 years ago. And we're just now releasing some documents. What could possibly be in those documents 60 years later that's going to reveal anything about anybody alive? That, I mean, I think we, you know, we have a publication review board at the CIA, and I think the FBI and other intelligence organizations have the same thing. So I'm obliged to send them copies of anything that I write, even if it's spy fiction, like my 2 spy novels. I had to send those to them. And it's a lot of times when these people look at these things, I think it's almost subjective and how they felt when they got up that morning as to whether they're going to call this classified or not classified. To me, if it's classified, that means if it was revealed, it would either reveal sources or methods or somehow hurt the national security of the United States. If it doesn't do any of that, then why are we calling it classified? You know, it's silly. In my first book, Living Lies, about the Iranian nuclear program, it took them a year to review that. This is a novel, it's fiction. And okay, I agree it has to be reviewed because I would never want to intentionally or unintentionally hurt the national security of the United States. So it took them a year. When I got it back, I found that they had basically redacted 5 things, a phrase here, a word or two there, literally not very much. None of it, in my opinion, was classified. And I would be willing to bet, you know, my fortune that none of this was truly classified. But since none of the redactions that they wanted affected the storyline, I thought, okay, do I really want to try and appeal this and drag this out another few months? And so I just said, fine. And I took out the offending word or words here and there, 5 little, you know, things, 5 instances. And so then when I turned in my second spy novel, In the Twinkling of an Eye, it only took them a month to review it with no redactions, and they had a request for a copy for the CIA library. So I think maybe because I didn't get into an argument with them on the first one, that they were a little easier with me on the second one. I mean, I agree that we need to have the review process so that there's no intentional or unintentional revelation of truly classified information. But I do think we need to take a closer look at, well, what is really classified and what's not? When do we hurt the United States by revealing this, or hurt a source? Or is this just being, you know, that iron plate? Let's just put it, you know, if we need 3 inches, well, let's make it 6 inches or 9 inches. And that's kind of silly. And a lot of our information anymore, by the way, comes from open source. So that's good. That's great. We need open source. We need a vibrant open source community, and that frequently tells us a lot about our adversaries.
Now, one thing that's changed now from previous handlings of various defectors and traitors and moles is that they are now being used more effectively for propaganda and information warfare and operations by Russia, China, and so forth. Whereas in the past, the propaganda effect was relatively limited. These people were considered basically unusable after defection. But people like Snowden today continue to be at the heart of various operations. To what extent can we, first of all, duplicate the success of such an approach on our own end, and to what extent what can we do to prevent the damage, to mitigate the damage from any US defectors or moles being used for continuous propaganda operations for years to come?
Well, I think that one of the most effective things is just to try and have vigorous news people, journalists such as yourself, to reveal the truth that's out there. If it's the truth, we shouldn't be afraid of it. And, you know, they are afraid of the truth. You look and see the propaganda operations that the Chinese and the Russians, I mean, they've been masters of this for decades, the Russians especially. And the more truth, the more light you shine on it. I mean, that's like sunshine is the best disinfectant for germs and things like that. Yeah, they're going to twist this. They're masters at it. For They'll take some of these stories, you know, the fact that CIA created AIDS or that CIA imported drugs into Los Angeles. How ridiculous! Um, but you know, it didn't matter how ridiculous it was. You know, people, the average American or the average reader or listener, well, I heard it on the internet. It's got to be true. And people will say these things. It doesn't take. And now with AI, that's actually scary. You know that they can now. You're no longer going to have a propagandist to do this. You'll have AI mechanisms that can create these deep fakes. They can have people, supposedly a famous person, saying something that they never said, or they'll create these memes which are humorous, but you know, are really politically directed. I think all we can do, you know, I don't know. I don't think the CIA should get involved with that. I mean, we are prohibited from creating things that would affect listeners or viewers in the United States. But I think, frankly, giving journalists such as yourself the encouragement to reveal the truth, you know, shine the light of truth. I don't. There's nothing out there that I would be ashamed of. If I'm ashamed of it, we shouldn't have done it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I look at it. And so I think we need to have more, you know, hardworking journalists out there shining spotlights on lies and fakes, deep fakes, propaganda, things like that. Um, you know, I think the United States has a pretty good track record of telling the truth. Radio Free Europe was a hope of a lot of people in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. Voice of America, voice of, you know, liberty, Radio Liberty. I noticed that you interviewed a while back Natan Sharansky. He's one of my heroes. Natan Sharansky is one of my heroes. I remember in the mid 80s, you know, here he was, this refusenik, brilliant man, a chess player, a physicist, a brilliant man. And I remember when they released him and he walked across the spire of bridges. And I just loved the fact they told him walk in a straight line and he intentionally did a zigzag across that bridge. But, you know, we need people like Natan Sharansky. We need to have people that are willing to tell the truth. And to me, the truth is the greatest disinfectant of this germ-laden propaganda and deep fakes. But we need to be aware of it, and we need to work with the AI community. How can we detect these deep fakes? How can we prove to the audiences out there that this is not the truth?
You know, I actually think that despite all the hype about technology and the use of technology to deceive, to amplify the messaging, still the greatest factor in human interactions, whether it's intelligence or counterintelligence, still remains the human factor, because at the end of the day, it's the humans who have to question where is that information coming from? Is it something original, or does it sound a lot like what I've seen from human beings or whatever? Does it really matter whether it's AI or a human being? The question is whether or not it's actually true, whether or not it aligns with the reality. You still have to question it, no matter what the level of technical output and influence is. But I want to kind of bring us to the last part of the discussion, because I don't want to take too much of your time, which is the influence of pop culture and literature and on perception of intelligence and understanding. To what extent do what Hollywood and writers get it right, and to what extent do you think it creates a sort of distrust and misunderstanding, or the opposite, of the intelligence community, and creates this predilection for conspiracy theory thinking and obsession with kind of insider threats versus very legitimate external threats?
That's an excellent question, Irina. I think that, you know, we have to remember that if I write a spy novel, it's more entertainment than reality.
Mhm.
I think my novels are pretty realistic. The place where I get to where it's not realistic is the compression of the time scale.
Mhm.
If I wrote a spy story the way that spy stories really play out, the reader would fall asleep. It's frequently a very slow, very methodical pace, and then it might take off like a rocket, but you have to compress the time scale sometimes in these stories. And I mean, I read a lot of espionage fiction, and some of it I admire, and a lot of it I don't, because it's so unrealistic as to what's going on. A friend of mine, Ilana Berry, I encourage you to maybe contact her and have her on your program. She just wrote a splendid spy novel called The Peacock and the Sparrow. And Ilana was a case officer for a number of years and has written a very realistic spy novel. Another colleague, David McCloskey, wrote Damascus Station, excellent spy novel, and he's got a background as an intelligence officer. And then there's Alma Katsu, a good friend of mine. She's written both Red Widow and Red London, super stories. She was a CIA and an NSA analyst for a number of years, so she knows what she's talking about. Um, these stories are fiction, they're entertaining, and they're not necessarily realistic.
Mhm.
So that's, and I see some of the movies sometimes. And in fact, I just had dinner the other night with James Grady, who wrote 6 Days of the Condor, which was turned into the wonderful movie 3 Days of the Condor.
Mhm.
And Jim Grady is a wonderful guy. I had a delightful dinner with him. And he wrote that novel, 6 Days of the Condor, when he was only 24 years old, which is just stunning when you think about it. And he's written a number, probably another 10 or 15 books after that. But again, it's fiction. And I told him, I said, one of the reasons I joined the CIA was I enjoyed 6 Days of the Condor so much, which is ironic because it's all about a CIA officer who's pursued by all of his CIA colleagues who are trying to kill him. So I said, it's almost like I had a suicide wish to join the CIA after reading your novel.
Well, one last question that actually speaks directly to your own background as a lawyer who ended up in doing clandestine operations, which is, of course, the show The Recruit, which talks about someone who started as a lawyer for the CIA and ended up doing precisely that. I understand that many of the elements of the show are just, basic fiction, but one of the questions I do have is about this interaction between this tension between the legal officers trying to prevent excesses in the and harebrained schemes from ever coming to fruition, and of course the clandestine services which are charged with a certain of taking on a certain level of risk. So where is that balance? How do we accurately what is the more accurate vision of the uh, legal dilemmas and balancing them with the necessities of the job?
Superb question. I think that my legal training was absolutely perfect for my career as an operations officer. For one thing, all of my colleagues who are really attorneys in our CIA's Office of General Counsel, I never had any problems with any of them. They knew that as a fellow attorney, I understood what the limits were, and they could communicate with me and they trusted me to adhere to their guidance. And their guidance a lot of times was, that we would discuss an operational proposal with them, and they would say, okay, let's not do it that way. But if you do it this other way, and you can do the same thing, but
Mhm.
stay within US guidelines, within US laws, here's what we would suggest you do. Probably the most stunning application of this was a good friend of mine, Rolf Moat Larsen. He was my successor in a European station, and he proposed an operation, a counterproliferation operation, and he sent that into headquarters. And I read it, and the first thing I did was, we could never do this. This isn't going to. This is impossible. They would never approve this. And I literally put it in what we call our burn bag to be destroyed. And then I started thinking, now am I turning into the quintessential headquarters officer who just says no? So I fished it out of my burn bag. I straightened it out. And at that point, I saw a good friend of mine, Peter Comfort, who was a member of he was, in fact, a counsel for this part of the agency. And I asked him to come in and read this and tell me his opinion. So Peter came in, he read the proposal, and then he looked at me and he said, Jim, my opinion is if you don't do this, they should fire you. I thought, okay, thank you. And so I got along extremely well with all of the members of the Office of General Counsel. They knew they could trust me to not get us into trouble, and I trusted them to give me the guidelines to keep us out of trouble.
Well, I think that is a very interesting view. I think most people don't really think about it. And honestly, I think there's been a lot of bad press to the intelligence community due to political issues that I think begin and end at a certain level and don't necessarily impact a lot of the minutiae of the day-to-day intelligence activity.
Right.
And this sort of perception, I am wondering how can we overcome this level of distrust and paranoia about things that are not necessarily directly, related to one another.
Right. Well, I think that we have a lot of guidelines. We work closely with not only with our attorneys at Office of General Counsel, but also with the National Security Council. A lot of my operations the AQCon operation, for one, I had to have the trust of the National Security Council and of the White House, and operating on a presidential memorandum of notification. And they had to trust me to, basically not get us into trouble and to take down a WMD threat. And I have to say, I had strong bipartisan support. I had to, brief the senior members of both parties. And it was always, how can we help you? They were not trying to make this a political statement. So I felt very confident that I had the full backing of our senior management, as well as the National Security Council, the Congress, and the White House.
That is very fascinating, especially for me. I'm actually a lawyer by training, and my background is specifically in national security issues. So I've always wondered how this all plays out beyond the media headlines in the background, how these sort of interactions actually transpire, and where do you draw the line between, these sort of tensions exist in every sphere: privacy and security, and risk in the sense. Law and sometimes the need to break the law outside the country. But thank you so much for this very in-depth, very perceptive, and insightful look into this, into the practice of intelligence. I think that it's very common these days to focus entirely on broader policy issues, but not on the technical details and the skills and the tradecraft and the issues that actually help manage these issues beyond politics. And I think this is where people like you can come in and kind of separate the political and the opinions and the polemics of it from the technical jobs that need to be done and how they are actually executed. And I thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome, Irina. It was a pleasure being on the program. You asked great questions, and I very much enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, and I hope we'll stay in touch, and I'll look forward to also talking to your colleagues and fellow writers in the near future. Thank you so much. And for those watching the program, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. We'll be back next Tuesday, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And thank you for watching.